Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Hello, and you're very welcome to today's Signpost webinar. We hope you're keeping safe and well wherever you're joining us from today. Today, we're going to be talking about water quality, and we know that water quality is fundamental to the long-term viability of Irish agriculture. Clean water underpins livestock farming, food production, and Ireland's reputation as a producer of high-quality, sustainable sourced food. And Ireland's sixth Nitrates Action Programme and associated Nitrates Derogation represents the regulatory framework within which agriculture must now operate to protect that resource. And today we examine what these measures mean in practice and how farming and water quality can be managed together sustainably. And we're delighted to be joined by Ted Massey, who is Senior Inspector with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, who's going to walk us through some updates in relation to the nitrates regulations as we know them. Good morning, Ted. How are you today?
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm very good, very good.
Great.
So, Ted, we were both saying you're in the Department of Agriculture now, working in the water quality area. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, certainly, Mark. So looking, good morning, everyone. Back in 2022, I was appointed to the current role, where I am now head of Water and Air Quality Division within the Department of Agriculture. So what essentially that requires me to do is to work with colleagues in the department to facilitate a reduction in agriculture's impact on both air quality and water quality. So in practical terms, that primarily relates to reducing nutrient loss from farms to water. And then with regard to air, reducing ammonia emissions as well. So we can comply with our legislative requirements, but also, ensure we have a sustainable future for Irish agriculture as well.
And incidentally, there's a good news story to be told there on the ammonia side. Is that correct?
Yeah, there is. Like back in 2020-21, we were in breach of our ammonia emissions limit as set out under the EU legislation. But since then, through a range of measures adopted by Irish farmers, we have got ourselves back into compliance and well into compliance in recent years. So in terms of the data that the EPA have published in that regard, the latest data is 2024, and similar to 2022 and 2023, it has shown us to be in compliance. And I suppose the rollout of low emission slurry spreading, in particular through the Nitrates Action Programme, has been critical to that achievement. Obviously, since then, we also have more recently the restriction on the use of unprotected urea in granular form as well. So that should feed into future years' data, because when it comes to ammonia, we have to be conscious from 2030 onwards, there will be stricter lower limits. So we obviously have to keep an eye on that too, And a big driver of ammonia emissions is livestock numbers and fertilizer use. So we just have to keep monitoring the situation, but it is a good news story, certainly.
Great. Looking forward to your presentation. Thanks, Ted.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So, guys, this morning I'm going to talk to you about Irish water quality, our Nitrates Action Programme that was introduced in January, and the Nitrates Derogation covering the period 2026 to 2028. So to begin with, Irish water quality, well, our water quality is good compared to other EU member states. However, the reality is it's not as good as it should be. When we look at EPA data, it is clear that agriculture is the most frequent significant pressure on Irish water quality. However, that's not necessarily surprising, in that agriculture accounts for around 2/3 of our land use. So, it is going to have an impact. But what we need to look at is nutrients in particular, because excess nutrients are the main challenge that we face from an agricultural perspective in terms of water quality. In recent years, there has been very significant activity undertaken across the agri-food sector to reduce the losses of nitrogen and phosphorus to water, and that is very welcome. However, ultimately, there will always be a lag time between when an action takes place and when we see its full impact environmentally, and we need to see those actions translating into clear evidence of improvement, because data is becoming increasingly important. And while we introduced a Nitrates Action Programme in January, while we have secured an extension to our derogation, in reality, in 18 months' time from now, we'll be back into a review phase. We'll be considering the policy context, engaging with the European Commission about the situation that will pertain from 2029 onwards. So it's very important that we see the action that's taking place on the ground now translating into evidence of improvement in terms of water quality. And why is that data becoming so much more important? Well, that largely goes back to the Water Framework Directive. And I appreciate for a lot of people on the call, they'll be familiar with the Nitrates Directive, but the Water Framework Directive is a very important overarching piece of legislation. And it sets out the idea of an integrated, harmonized, combined approach to dealing with water pollution. So the Nitrates Directive is a measure under the Water Framework Directive, but the Water Framework Directive covers a number of other pieces of legislation. For example, it deals with urban wastewater, bathing water, drinking water. And under the Water Framework Directive, all water bodies are protected. And all water bodies, with some minor exceptions, are meant to achieve at least good ecological status by 2027. Now, no EU member state is going to achieve that. From our perspective, based on the EPA data published last autumn, 52% of our water bodies are currently achieving at least good ecological status. So that means the other 48% need to show improvement. And the 52% that are where they should be, we have to try and hold on to them to maintain what status they have. And if you just look at the map on the right of the screen, you can see the latest ecological status in terms of our river water bodies. Those that are in blue and green are achieving their objectives under the Water Framework Directive. But you can see there's a mosaic across the country of areas in yellow in particular and orange. And those are areas where we need to see improvements. Thankfully, there's very little red on the map because red are rivers that are in bad ecological status. So thankfully, we don't have many of them, but we need to see the moderate and the poor moving up towards good, okay? And how are we doing that? Well, the government has published the River Basin Management Plan, which is the competence of my colleagues in the Department of Housing. And the latest iteration of that, the third River Basin Management Plan, is commonly called the Water Action Plan 2024. So that's available on the Department of Housing's website. And under that Water Action Plan, each sector that is impacting on water has developed a sectoral action work plan. And that's where the sector sets out the actions they're undertaking. And the Department of Housing tracks our progress against those actions. So there's a big focus on progress and monitoring of activity to ensure the sectors are doing what they're meant to be doing. Within Agriculture's Sectoral Action Plan, the Nitrates Action Programme is a key part of that, along with other things such as support for ASAP, support for the Farming for Water EIP. So to move on to talk about the Nitrates Directive and our Nitrates Action Programme. Now, I'm sorry, the slides just are slow to move. Okay. So the EU Nitrates Directive is in place for 35 years at this stage. And I said it's an integral part of the Water Framework Directive that's followed subsequently. The Nitrates Directive has a number of key features. The first one is it sets the limit of 170 kilograms on the application of livestock manure to land. But in the next line, it states a higher limit may apply, providing it's justified. And that higher limit has become commonly known as the Nitrates Derogation. But in reality, it's not a derogation. It's no exemption from a rule. It's the application of the higher limit as provided for within the directive in recognition of the fact that across the EU member states, there are different circumstances. Overall, the Nitrates Directive aims are to protect water quality from nutrients from agricultural sources and to promote good farming practice. And the directive requires each member state to develop a Nitrates Action Programme. So our first Nitrates Action Programme came into force in 2006. And it is designed to prevent pollution of watercourses from agricultural sources, to protect and improve water quality. And to do that, from the outset, Ireland took a national approach covering both nitrogen and phosphorus in our Nitrates Action Programme, and there would be very few EU member states that did that. And the reason we cover both phosphorus and nitrogen is because both of those nutrients impact on our water. However, those impacts differ regionally and by nutrient as well. So in terms of our Nitrates Action Programme, we're obliged under the directive to review it at least once every 4 years. And if you look back at those iterations of our Nitrates Action Programme, you will see a continual strengthening of measures within the programme. And in particular, in the 5th NAP that was introduced in 2022 and the 6th NAP introduced at the start of this year, there are stronger measures. We now have the strongest ever Nitrates Action Programme and protection in terms of water quality from an agricultural perspective. And the Nitrates Action Programme is given legal effect through what's formerly called the Good Agricultural Practice for the Protection of Waters regulations. And that is SI 588 of 2025. And it was amended in the spring by SI 119 of 2026 to provide for the derogation that we secured. They're commonly called the GAP regs or the nitrates regs. So what are the objectives for our current Nitrates Action Programme? Well, first of all, it was about trying to achieve the right combination of measures to drive the changes we require. So we're using all the levers for change: regulation to direct change, knowledge transfer and awareness raising to inform change, and incentivization to reward change. So what does that translate to in reality? Well, regulation is obviously the nitrates regulations. Knowledge transfer, awareness raising is about informing farmers and those who are supporting farmers across the agricultural industry about the impact certain measures can have and how things can be done better. And then incentivization is about using the likes of EU or nationally funded schemes or industry sustainability schemes to recognize and reward best practice on farm, practices that are going above and beyond minimum regulatory requirements. In terms of the Nitrates Action Programme, we've identified an impactful set of measures that are grounded in science, targeting key issues. And those measures have been very much informed through intensive stakeholder consultation. So back in 2023, the Department of Agriculture established the Agriculture Water Quality Working Group. And over the following 3 years, that group has essentially met almost once per month. We've met over 30 times. And that group has been instrumental in terms of developing the collaborative approach that now exists across the agri-food sector towards addressing the challenge that is water quality. The Nitrates Action Programme is aligned with the requirements set out in the Nitrates Directive, the Water Framework Directive, and the objectives set under the Habitats Directive. And ultimately, our aim is to secure a sustainable future for Irish agriculture by protecting and improving water quality. So to quickly run over the measures that are there, and I'm going to move across these pretty quickly because a lot of you will be familiar with them. So we've maximum stocking rate limits. We've closed periods for the spreading of organic and chemical fertilizer. We have maximum fertilizer application rates. We have got green cover requirements on tillage land. We have got minimum storage period requirements. We have got requirements to use low emission slurry spreading for a lot of Irish farmers now. And as I said earlier, that has been key in terms of reducing our ammonia emissions. We've got requirements around buffer strips adjacent to water. We have soil sampling requirements. We have requirements around the prevention of runoff from farm roadways or poached land. We have requirements to exclude bovine access to watercourses. And we've requirements regarding the reporting of organic nutrient movements between farms. So they now have to be reported within 4 days. They were all requirements introduced under the fifth NAP or previous nitrates action programs that have been maintained and brought forward. And then to look at the key regulatory changes in the sixth nitrates action program, we've three key measures that have been introduced. The first one relates to the milking platform. So this is the area where cows graze around the milking parlour. And on fragmented dairy farms, there is a risk that this area will receive a disproportionate level of the nutrients compared to other blocks on the land. So our aim is to improve nutrient distribution on fragmented intensive farms by moving nutrients to out blocks of land or reducing chemical nitrogen allowance if that milking platform is above a certain stocking rate. And there is an FAQ on the milking platform measure that is published on our Department of Agriculture website. The link is there, and that is updated regularly based on feedback and queries we're getting from the likes of advisors and farmers. We also have increased slurry and soiled water storage capacity requirements on dairy farms. So from the 1st of October 2028, dairy farmers will be required to have a 21% increase in slurry storage per cow and a 43% increase in soiled water storage capacity requirements. Now, we are amending how we're calculating the soiled water storage capacity requirement to better align it with what is actually going to be produced on farms as well. And those storage capacity requirements have come out of Teagasc research on Irish dairy farms that confirmed the need for additional storage. We also have a prohibition on the application of sewage sludge to arable land in the autumn in the Barrow and Slaney and Wexford Harbour catchments. And the aim there is to match the timing of nutrient application with crop demand to mitigate risk of nutrient loss. And why is it just in those three catchments? Because they essentially receive a lot of sewage sludge onto arable land, and in those catchments, the soil is such that it's susceptible to leaching of nitrogen in particular. So it's particularly important that we avoid excess application of nitrogen to that land in the autumn. We also have a range of non-regulatory measures as well. So just to pick up on them, we've expansion of the ASSA program that's in place since late 2018 and proven to be really successful. A continuation of the Farming for Water European Innovation Partnership that now has seen over 5,500 farmers apply to participate. And we've a strong emphasis on knowledge transfer and awareness raising for both farmers and farm advisors. So as part of that, we've already rolled out in-person training to over 860 accredited farm advisory system advisors. We have plans in terms of a Know Your Local Water Quality initiative for farmers. And we also are looking at the training that's being provided for our future farmers. So those going through agricultural college and third level institutions. Are they getting the training they require in terms of water quality? And then for those servicing the industry, the advisors, the professionals servicing the industry, are they all aware of the impact that certain farm decisions can have on water quality? We also have plans to undertake research regarding malic soil analysis to better quantify plant available nutrients. There's research underway regarding cover crop establishment to see how we can get more cover crops in the ground in a timelier manner, in a more cost-effective manner, to make it easier for farmers to do that sort of thing that will mitigate the risk of nutrient loss. And we are also committed to a continuation of Teagasc's agricultural catchments program that will be extended beyond 2027, and Teagasc are working on that as we speak. So to move on then to talk about the nitrates derogation then. Our derogation is in place since 2006. We've had it for the last 20 years. And in line with the Nitrates Directive, it is reviewed at least once every 4 years. At this stage, we are the only member state in the EU in receipt of a nitrates derogation. But we have a unique set of circumstances when you look across the EU. And our derogation is justified by our high rainfall, our long growing season, and the dominance of high nitrogen uptake crops, i.e. grass, within our agricultural system. And you know, when you look across those three parameters, across the EU, post-Brexit, there is no other EU member state that has the same levels of rainfall that we have, that has the long growing season that we have, and that has the dominance of grass that we have across our agricultural landscape. And that sets us out as being unique and justifies our derogation. So our derogation allows our more intensive farmers to farm at higher stocking rates, up to 250 kilograms of N per hectare in certain parts of the country. And around 7,000 farmers apply for a nitrates derogation each year. So that's around 5% of our farmers. The derogation will close for applications next Friday in terms of the 2026 derogation. And while it's only around 5% of our farmers, they're a very important cohort, because around half of our dairy farmers are stocked above 170 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and around 2/3 of the milk that is produced nationally comes from those farms that are stocked above 170. In return for qualifying for the derogation farmers are subject to stricter rules to mitigate risks around water quality, and they are subject to a 10% inspection rate each year. And when we look at the outcome of those inspections, we find that the derogation farmers are more compliant than ordinary farmers. So notwithstanding the fact that we have stricter rules and higher requirements, the derogation farmers are more likely to pass the inspections. And that is important. These are farmers that take water quality seriously, and they understand the importance of working to improve water quality, because in particular, they're getting something in return in terms of the derogation. So looking at our current derogation, well, what's new? So compared to the derogation that we had last year, we now have obligations for farmers to complete a nutrient balance on AgNav by the end of next year. So all derogation farmers will have to do that. They'll also have to undertake training in grassland management. And then with effect from January 2028, in 4 named river catchments, there will be a 5% reduction in the chemical nitrogen allowance, and there will be increased buffer strip requirements for derogation farmers. And this is the first time that specific river catchments have been listed in a derogation decision from the European Commission for Ireland. And the reason why those 4 catchments are listed is because they have the greatest gap to target in terms of the nitrogen load reduction that is required to meet the Water Framework Directive objectives. So while there are 4 of them there, and that goes back to a report published by the EPA last August, it's very important that across all our rivers, we work to reduce nitrogen levels. And we also work to reduce phosphorus levels as well. I wouldn't place particular significance on the fact that those 4 are listed. Yes, the gap to target is greatest there. But for those where the gap is smaller or that are already meeting their requirements under the Water Framework Directive, we obviously have to continue to work to ensure that that gap is closed, or that we continue to comply with our requirements. And then most significantly, the derogation decision requires environmental assessments to be undertaken with regard to the granting of derogations. And specifically, if we look at the wording that's in the Commission implementing decision, it states that Ireland shall, as soon as possible, and at the latest by the end of 2028, complete environmental assessments pursuant to Directive 92/43, which is the Habitats Directive, and Directive 2000/60, which is the Water Framework Directive, taking into account the judgment of the Court of Justice of the EU in case C-531 of 2024. And that case relates to An Teagasc's judicial review regarding the 5th Nitrates Action Programme and the 9 questions that the Irish High Court referred on to the Court of Justice of the European Union. We don't yet have a judgment in that case. We expect it will likely come in the coming months, but that will set out the case law and the obligations. And that's why it's important that the assessments we are going to undertake have to take that into account. So what does this mean in reality? And how are we going to approach this? So in terms of the assessments, we're going to use the source pathway receptor framework an approach that's commonly used in catchment science. And the key issue is you have to consider the source of the nutrients, the pathway that will carry those nutrients from the source to the receptor. And it's only where you have a combination of all three, the source, the pathway, and the receptor intersecting, that there is a risk to water quality. So to look at this in the context of the derogation then, the source is our derogation farms. So we've 7,000 derogation farms nationally, but we also have to consider other agricultural activity as well. The pathway then, in particular, is hydrological. So that's how things move through our water, okay? And obviously our water can carry things a long distance. And then we also have to consider aerial pathways as well. So air, and in particular ammonia. So what impact can a derogation farm have on a designated site under the Habitats Directive that's located in the vicinity of that? And then the receptor is the designated site. So we have to consider the country nationally. We're going to do this based on the subcatchments defined and mapped for the Water Framework Directive, and there are 583 of those. And we'll have to look at each of those to consider, is there a source in terms of derogation farms? Is there a pathway that could transfer nutrients either hydrologically or through air between those derogation farms and a designated site? So if there are no derogation farms, or the derogation farms are, for example, downstream of a designated site, there's no risk to a receptor. And that will exclude a proportion of the country. It'll exclude around 120 of those subcatchments. But for the remaining approximately 460, we will have to go through an appropriate assessment process. In line with the Commission implementing decision, our objective is to publish those draft appropriate assessments in 2028 for public consultation, and then to have them finalized before the end of 2028. We also have to conduct assessments with regard to the Water Framework Directive as well. And that is to look at, how is derogation farming potentially impacting on our objectives in terms of achieving good ecological status. And as we do these assessments, there will be three possible outcomes. There will be areas where everything is fine and things can continue as they are. There will be areas where there is a risk to a designated site, or there is a risk in terms of achieving those Water Framework Directive objectives. And in those areas, the question will be, can we introduce additional measures that will mitigate that risk and provide for a scenario where derogation farming could continue in those areas? Or will it simply be not feasible to mitigate those risks? And in that scenario, unfortunately, we will be looking at a case where derogation farming will not be able to continue. But we have to go through the assessment process before we can get to those outcomes. And it would be wrong to prejudge where it is likely to pass or fail the assessment process. And for us looking at it, we'll be very keen to work with stakeholders as part of that process to see what additional mitigants we can introduce to mitigate risk and allow farmers avail of the derogation, possibly subject to additional rules, but to give them that flexibility if we can. And then just before we conclude then, to look at other practices outside the Nitrates Action Programme that are obviously very important in terms of water quality. So pesticides. It's very important that farmers and people advising farmers are conscious of label instructions on pesticides, and in particular risks associated with drift, and where products such as MCPA, for example, to control rushes on heavy land, often land where the water table isn't very far from the surface, are used responsibly to ensure that there is no impact on water quality. It's critically important that hazardous chemicals are dealt with appropriately and disposed of appropriately. So they will not pollute our waters or our soils. In certain parts of the country, we do have challenges around sheep dip and the impact that is having on our water. And then we also have to be conscious of the potential impact that land improvement activities can have on our water ecology. So land drainage can have an impact in terms of removing the buffers that can often, filter and denitrify our water before it reaches a watercourse. And if we put in a pipe, essentially the nutrients that are in that water are going to move through the pipe very quickly instead of maybe slowly moving through the soil that will filter and polish that water. And land improvement works can also have a very direct impact on the ecology in our waters. So, for example, the risks associated with sediment that will come from land drainage work and excavation work in our watercourses. So we would just ask farmers to be very conscious of potential impacts in that regard. And so to conclude then, our Nitrates Action Programme sets out measures to protect and improve water quality. Our derogation allows a small proportion of our farmers farm at higher stocking rates subject to stricter environmental rules. We need to look at nutrient concentrations in our waters and work to get them down. We saw progress in 2024 in terms of a reduction in nitrogen concentration in our rivers. But the EPA's early insights report for last year shows nitrogen concentration in our rivers went back up. So the progress we achieved in 2024 has essentially been lost. There is significant action underway across the sector to reduce losses of both nitrogen and phosphorus. And it is important when we look at data year on year that we're conscious of impacts things such as weather can have. And ultimately, what we need is to see a long-term trend of improvement in water quality. We need to see more work to reduce nutrients in our waters and to improve ecology, because if we can reduce our nutrients in our waters, we know the ecology in our waters will improve and we will move closer to that Water Framework Directive objective of achieving at least good ecological status. When we think about it, we'll be back into a review engaging with the European Commission about the situation post-2028 in little over 18 months' time. So it's very important that the action that is taking place out on the ground now translates into evidence of improvement, because data will be the key in terms of water quality to securing a sustainable future for Irish agriculture. Now, Mark, that ends the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'll be very happy to take questions. Thank you.
That's great, Ted. Thank you so much. Really, really comprehensive presentation, and gives us a good, I suppose, history of where the nitrates has come from as well. You mentioned the Water Framework Directive and 2027 being an important year in that cycle. And you also mentioned that we're at 52% of water bodies at good status here in Ireland. What happens to that process? Is that kicking off again? And just be interested to understand what the implications will be. What if, it's obviously at this stage unlikely we're going to be hitting those, that reaching that good status across all water bodies.
Yeah, so first of all, the EPA assess our compliance in terms of good ecological status on a 3-year cycle. Okay, so the report they published last autumn, it looked at the period ending 2024. The next report they will publish will not be published until 2028. It'll cover the period ending 2027. So the data we have now is the data we will have in 2027. Okay, and as you say, only 52% of our water bodies are meeting their objective. But across the EU, no EU member state is going to meet that objective. So there are talks at a European level, how can this issue be addressed? Were the targets realistic? So we'll see what happens in that space. But from our perspective in Ireland, we are not going to get very far by saying, well, sure, no EU member state is meeting this target. We are the people who are seeking to avail of the Nitrates Derogation. We're the only member state in that regard. And it becomes more challenging for the Commission to justify granting us a derogation if our water quality is not going the right direction, in particular in the context of that 2027 deadline, and us being a member state like everyone else who isn't going to meet it.
We have a question coming in here, and do keep the questions coming using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen in relation to heavily modified water bodies and how that impacts the ecological status of these water bodies. And instead, they're moving to a lower, more flexible standard of good ecological potential. And why was this action taken in light of the information you're presenting here today? So I'm not sure, Ted, you happy to comment on that one?
Yeah, now that would go back to the competence of my colleagues in the Department of Housing, okay? But, we do have some heavily modified water bodies. And, the question is, can they achieve good ecological status, or is it more so to get to a point where there's the potential of achieving that, okay? And that goes back to discussions at an EU level in terms of, this 2027 target and what that means. But from our perspective, from an agricultural perspective, it's about reducing nutrient concentration in water. That's what we have to be focused on, because if we do that, we know that the ecology will improve in our rivers.
Mm-hmm. A quick question slash clarification: the 5% reduction that you mentioned in chemical N across the three catchments, is this a 5% reduction on grassland alone, or will it include tillage lands as well? Is it all lands?
No, it's just grassland, and it is just on the allowances for derogation farmers in those areas.
Okay, very good. And just to let people know, we have the facility there is to submit questions anonymously. Is there, if you're not comfortable your name being associated with a question, that facility is there. So do keep those questions coming into us. A more precise question here: do we have an updated calculator to account for the changes for slurry and soiled water? And if so, can it be issued?
So we are working on that at the moment, and we would like to be in a position to issue it to advisors fairly soon. We did write to all dairy farmers earlier this spring, outlining the changes that will apply from 2028. And obviously, as part of our training of the accredited FAS advisors, we went through those changes, but we are developing support tools. And I'd say keep an eye on the department's website. So in terms of nitrates, it's gov.ie/nitrates, and you'll see supports there for farmers and advisors.
Very good. You mentioned the training courses for farmers, derogation farmers, the grassland management course. Is there any more information about that, the length and method of delivery? Is that available at this stage?
So that's something we're scoping out still. Our objective is to provide training for advisors in the autumn of this year, and we have a steering group that's designing that training. It involves people from Teagasc, from the Private Agricultural Consultants Association, and the EPA, and the local authorities' waters program, working with ourselves basically to make sure that training will target the key messages and deliver the optimum outcomes. So first of all, we're going to train the advisors who are going to deliver the training then to farmers. And it'll be broad training around grassland management, but we don't yet have that fully scoped out. That training group is working on that.
A question that feeds back to a comment you mentioned earlier on about the water or the assessments that you're doing using the pathway receptor model. You talked about airborne nutrients. Is that relating to ammonia, or was it?
Yeah.
Because the question I have here is eliminating 120 water bodies from the assessment as they are located downstream of the monitoring station may be justified where there are lower risks to water, but what about the risk to nearby designated habitats with ammonia losses? So it kind of wraps into that question.
Yes, and that's where it's important for everyone to be aware that when we do these assessments, we have to consider, you know, both pathways, the hydrological, what will move through water, either above the surface or below the surface of our soil, and what will be moved through air. And that's where ammonia is very important, because we know ammonia can have impacts on designated sites. There's some sites that are particularly sensitive to ammonia. So it's not just about water quality when we do these assessments. And we'll have to look at essentially where things are spatially. So where is the designated site? Is there a risk to that designated site if derogation farming were to be permitted in that area?
Okay, and that could be an ecological, or sorry, a hydrological or water body, or it could be an actual habitat, land-based habitat. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's to consider, why was that area designated?
Mhm.
And then in terms of those qualifying interests that resulted in the designation, what status are they at? And how sensitive are they to nutrients? Because it's very important to bear in mind, there are some cases where areas were designated for species that will actually benefit from intensive farming, and there are other areas where the designation is due to the presence of a species that is highly sensitive to maybe nutrients, for example.
Um, Question on roofing of open slurry storage. It was mentioned a few years back to be completed by end of 2027 in the Climate Action Plan to reduce ammonia emissions. Will this be made mandatory?
So that was something that was looked at as part of the fifth nitrates action program. The idea that, should we require open slurry stores to have a roof? And when we considered it in terms of ammonia emissions, um, the fact that the slurry will often form a crust means that the emissions benefit was going to be relatively low, because the natural crust on top of the slurry will limit the loss in terms of gaseous losses. And then we also had to consider the fact that a lot of these outdoor, unroofed stores were designed without the intention of a roof being fitted to them. And structurally, what were the risks associated with trying to retrofit a roof? And the decision was made that the risks would outweigh the benefits. So essentially, in terms of going out and starting to drill holes and weld on things onto them, it was felt that that could interfere with the integrity of the stores, and it was better not to require them to be roofed. So that is the decision that has been made.
There's a question here. It relates to, I suppose, that peer pressure amongst the farming community around where other farmers witness or see bad practice, or members of the public. And it's something certainly we've witnessed in Teagasc, that, that there is a much lower tolerance there where somebody is doing something incorrectly, or maybe unwittingly causing a problem. What are the routes to notify that? Or and the question here is there a confidential phone number that somebody can report practices or events that are likely to have a negative effect on water quality? Or whose responsibility is that?
So I suppose what I would say is, like, obviously every farmer has a responsibility not to impact negatively on water. If somebody sees something that they're not happy with, I would say they have a responsibility to report it. Okay. And there are various ways they can do that. Like they can report it into nitrates@agriculture.gov.ie. We will take those things in confidence and we will follow up with them. If people wish, the EPA have an app, See It, Say It, that people can download to their phone, and it facilitates easy reporting as well. And it is something where we see a big mindset change from farmers. Years ago, there was sort of an attitude, well, sure, I'll turn a blind eye to that because, sure, that's what he wants to do anyway. Farmers now recognize the importance of reducing agriculture's impact on water. And a lot of farmers have invested very heavily to achieve that. And if they see their neighbors who've chosen not to invest, going out and, for example, spreading slurry in the closed period, there is not that same level of tolerance there that existed in the past. And if we find out, or if we're informed about it, we will take action in terms of sanctioning those farmers. And it's very important that people would report to us if they see things that they're not happy with on the ground.
Very good. Just to squeeze it in, a compliment in here, Ted, on your brilliant and clear presentation. So people welcoming that, and I'm sure lots of people will be looking back on today's presentation as well, just to, I suppose, as an overall update on where things are at on the whole nitrates journey. There's a question here about lower stocking rate, or farms that are stocked at a lower rate. They can also be problematic due to poor farm and land management practices. And are there any plans for these farms, or supports or targeting of these farms? You mentioned, I guess earlier on, that sort of higher levels of compliance with derogation farms. So it was just interesting to know what the thought process is there from the department's point of view.
Yeah. So, like as the thing behind me says, improving water quality is a matter for all of us. It's a matter for all farmers. It would be very wrong to think that the 5% of farmers with about the 10% of land that is farmed in derogation are the source of all our water quality problems nationally. We need action across all farms, across all farming sectors, if we're going to improve water quality. And the rules apply to all farmers. There are no exemptions from the regulations in terms of any cohort of farmer. So it's very important that everyone would follow those basic rules. And yes, there are higher requirements for the more intensive, but there are basic requirements for everybody there. And, it's important that those farmers would also engage in the likes of the knowledge transfer, the awareness raising as well. And I suppose that's something that has been a bit of a challenge, because the derogation farmers, through, for example, the mandatory training that they have to undertake, they're often more willing to attend training. And, they see the importance of water quality, as I said earlier. Other farmers may not fully appreciate the action that they can have in terms of negative impacts on water. So we have to work and communicate with all farmers in that regard. We have our own inspections as part of conditionality under the CAP strategic plan. The local authorities have a very significant target in terms of the National Ag Inspection Programme that is coordinated by the EPA. And, both us in the Department of Agriculture, the EPA and the local authorities all work closely together to ensure there's a consistency of approach across those farm inspections.
Okay, we're getting lots and lots of anonymous questions coming through since I brought people's attention to it. A question in relation to land drainage, and I suppose in more recent years it has been viewed quite negatively. Some call it the highway for nutrients to access water bodies, but there is a role for drainage there, and I think the question, or the comment here, is that properly installed land drainage does lower water tables from the surface to below the root horizon, and eliminating surface or overland flow, and eliminating the usual pathway of surface supply to nutrients. And the question is, why has the Department of Agriculture got such a fact wrong? Is I suppose the challenge there to you?
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say it's wrong, and I would agree with that attendee's comment that it can reduce overland flow. However, there's no benefit if we replace overland flow with something going in a pipe directly to the watercourse, if people can follow that logic. And the reality is, in certain parts of the country, we have traditionally had heavier land, often adjacent to a watercourse, which has acted as sort of a buffer, if you want. It's acted as a denitrifying area where water can move slowly through that land before it reaches the watercourse. And I would say the work over decades in terms of draining some of that land has contributed to the nitrogen concentration in our waters. So yeah, it can help in terms of phosphorus where overland flow can be an issue. But what impact is it having in terms of nitrogen? And that's where I'm just saying farmers need to be conscious of that. And that goes back to the knowledge transfer, the awareness raising. The perception that if you don't see a fish in the stream, there's nothing living there. In a healthy water environment, there should be a range of species living there, and depending on that stream for their life, basically.
I think the message there is properly installed drainage systems, taking account of those risks. I think is important. I know that Teagasc has developed a training course around land drainage and how it should be done correctly. And obviously, there's different solutions for different problems where you have overland flow or you have different types of flooding issues. Question here in relation to the nitrate stocking rate calculator available to farmers to predict stocking rates introduced in 2025 is not available for 2026 yet. Will this be available soon?
Yes, it will be available soon. And I suppose what we've traditionally done is when the direct payments application window closes, in terms of BIS, which will close next week, we will then have land areas for farmers, and we'll bring that into the calculator. And then farmers will be able to do work there in terms of predicting where they are going forward for the rest of the year. But what I would say, we are also working to develop our IT capacity as well, to bring things closer to real time for farmers and to expand their potential to use the likes of that calculator on My Ag Food to predict where they are, because we want to try and guide farmers towards compliance. Our aim is compliance, rather than a scenario where we're going out penalizing farmers, because that obviously, has already resulted in an environmental risk, and we want to avoid that risk.
So you're not trying to catch people out. It's just to provide that supporting environment. With the EU Soils Directive being adopted and entered into force on December 16th, 2025, is there an indication of how it will interact or affect the Water Framework Directive or Nitrates Directive? Is it early days yet on that, or have you any comment on that?
It's probably a little bit early days in terms of, and it's colleagues of mine are dealing with that, but my understanding is, people are still working out the exact monitoring requirements that will apply in terms of the soil health law. But I suppose what you can see over time is, and you see this in the case law in the Court of Justice of the EU, the need for coherence across different pieces of EU legislation. We can't just say we're fulfilling the objectives of the Nitrates Directive, we'll forget about the Habitats Directive, or we'll forget about the Water Framework Directive. There has to be a coherent approach across the different pieces of legislation.
There's a really good question has come in here about people understanding where people can understand the water quality in their local water bodies. Do you want to comment on that? I think the EPA is probably the location for that, is it?
Yeah, catchments.ie would be a place to look there, and try and drill into it and see your own specific area there.
Great, yeah. So catchments.ie, and there's water maps there. There's a huge amount of information available to people there. We've a few minutes left, so I'll just try and get through as many of the questions. And I know Ted I'll be sending a question or a copy of the questions on to you afterwards. So let me just pick one out here that as we have our 2.5 years left in the current derogation approval, when will Ireland start to review the next derogation, or when will that process kick off? Probably has started already.
You could very much argue we've started already. So I suppose, like, the appropriate assessments that we're going to have to do between now and 2028, they are going to inform that discussion. The reason why they're going to take until 2028 is simply because of the complexity and the scale of the ask. So, we have to do these 583 assessments. We have to bring in data around agricultural activity and also non-agricultural activity as well. So, for example, what impact is a local sewage treatment plant having on water quality in an area? And if derogation farming is maybe having a small impact, but it's coming on top of something else, what is that overall impact? So that's the kind of thing we have to do. We are also reflecting on policy to ensure that we have the science to support what we're going to do in 2029 and beyond. So, what are the research needs that we and the gaps that we have to fill, that we can have a scientifically grounded policy ready to roll out possibly in 2029. And like we've already engaged with Teagasc around that, we've identified certain things that we want to look at, and some of them are things that I touched on there in terms of cover crops, malic soil analysis. But what else should we be looking at?
I'm somewhat overwhelmed by the amount of questions here, Ted. It's a really, really popular topic. So it looks like we may have to have you back by popular demand. Just, I suppose, my colleague has asked me just to let people know that we will have a presentation on the National Agricultural Inspections Programme by the local authorities and EPA on the 24th of July. So that's just following on from today's presentation. A few questions coming in there about, I suppose, what are there any risks that more intensive farming systems may fall in under EPA licensing into the future? I know there's many pig farms and poultry farms that are under that category at the moment.
So yes, our larger pig and poultry units are subject to licensing by the EPA, and that goes back to the Industrial Emissions Directive, an EU piece of legislation. As far as I'm aware at the moment, there are no proposals to amend that. There were discussions on it previously, and it has been settled. So I'd say things remain as they are for the moment. Okay.
So look, Ted, I think we will leave it at that in terms of the questions because we're just coming up on time, and we have a lot of excellent comments and a lot of compliments on your presentation. And look, we'll try and get a copy of that presentation up on our website as well. I'm sure that people will be happy to step through that and just to recall what's just to get that update. I just want to bring people's attention to a number of events that are going to be happening in June, to get into your diary now, because some really interesting events, one in particular taking place on the 10th of June in Johnstown Castle, Farming for a Better Future, where they'll be looking at building resilient soils and improving water quality across dairy and beef systems and organic systems and so forth. So do get that date into your diary. Another important date following on from a very successful webinar we had with Don Summers. He's opening his farm to the public on the 17th of June. And he'll be talking about the good work that he's doing on his farm. Now, it is a family event, but registration is important because I think numbers will have to be limited to some degree. And of course, we will be having our National Beef event, Beef 2026, on the 1st of July in Teagasc in Grange. So a great opportunity to get to see all of the research and the advisory campaigns that are happening around and beef, and associated campaigns, of course, relating to water and climate and biodiversity and so on. So do put those into your diary, and we'll hope to see you at those events over the coming weeks. Ted, I just want to say huge thanks for joining us today, and your very I suppose matter-of-fact presentation there. I think people do appreciate that, and there's huge efforts I know gone in by your department to secure the derogation, and that work continues. So congratulations to you and your team for all of the good work that's happening there. Next week, we're going to be joined by Stephen Fagan, who is Business Development Manager with Glassport Bio, and Professor Vincent O'Flaherty, who's Chief Scientific Officer with Glassport Bio, and they're going to be talking about reducing methane emissions from slurry. So do join us next Friday for that really interesting presentation. And Ted, thanks again, and we'll hope to have you back again soon sometime.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, and certainly I'd be happy to come back another day. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ted. Take care.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.